Hello, my name is Katie Groves, and this is part 16 in my series on deprogramming from trauma-based mind control. If you've not done so already, I ask that you please watch the first two parts of this series, linked in the description below, for disclaimers and safety measures you can take while watching these videos. In this video, I'm going to be talking about dissociative identity disorder and mapping my system. When I first discovered that I had DID, I looked up some resources online for people with DID, and I found that people seemed to overwhelmingly recommend that survivors map their systems. So I decided to try that myself, and in this video I'm going to talk about some of the things I discovered, some of the tools I found, and ultimately why I gave up trying to map my system. So what is mapping one's system? Well, the idea is to get an idea of who is inside, how big the system is, and how the system is organized. Simply creating a map of what one's dissociative system looks like. So for some survivors, this is possible to do in full. For other survivors, it seems that they can only do it in part. And in my case, because I have something called exponential fragmentation, where I have near infinite self-replicating dissociative parts due to torture-based mind control, I was only able to map very small parts of my system, and I've learned to track the parts of my system that I'm in at any given time, but not worry so much about figuring out all the names and all the ages of all the voices inside. In the beginning, though, I didn't know that I was this fragmented. And every time I discovered a new layer of parts, I assumed that I had found them all. And after doing this several times in a row, I realized that I really couldn't know if I'd found all of myself yet, so I stopped trying to be so definite. But I did learn that if I wrote down names of parts and if I drew maps of the structures of how they were organized, with ages and dates of creation and things like that, I started to feel a sense of self-awareness, and I started to feel more organized inside. And it really helped me in the beginning with my deprogramming and my integration to show the parts of me that had been so neglected and so disconnected from me all my life, that I was really making an effort to get to know them and to figure out what was happening so that I could try and help us all. So more than mapping my system gave me a clear picture of my system, it allowed me to prove to my alters that I cared and wanted to know who they were. When I first started, I discovered that I had 6 or 7 alters. I say 6 or 7 because there was one that was not clearly defined as a single alter. That alter presented sometimes as an 8-year-old and sometimes as an 11-year-old. And that, to me, in retrospect, is a clear indication that I had polyfragmentation, meaning that my alters have alters, and also part of polyfragmentation means that I have to have a larger number of alters. But the fact that my alters have alters was a clear indication that I didn't just have regular DID, I had a more extreme form. But I didn't know this at the time, and when this presented in therapy, my therapist seemed very confused, and I don't think she knew a lot about polyfragmentation, if anything, and I didn't end up finding that relationship very helpful. But I did start to see that I had 6 or 7 parts that made up what I found to be my host self. Now, I've since discovered myriad more parts, but there was 6 or 7 very clearly defined, or almost clearly defined parts, who I first mistook to be my whole system. And when I first discovered these parts, I got really into drawing them and mapping them and talking to them, and I got very involved in figuring out who these parts were. And then one integrated. And when one of them integrated, I got an influx of data that there was more multiplicity than I knew that there was. I found that this part was fragmented into many, many more pieces, and all of a sudden I got an insight into myself that I had more multiplicity. And I started to let go piece by piece of the idea that I could really know how many parts I had. And a turning point for me around this is when I discovered the mathematical structure of my system and how fragmented I was. To a degree, I've discovered that I had a shell of mind controller parts called paradigm operators, literally worldview controllers, that were arranged in an arc around my host system that included those 6 or 7 parts, which at this point started integrating. And I found that there were 144 of these parts arranged in 18 cluster groups of 8 alters each. And those numbers are all very significant to me. 144 is 12 squared. And that's when I started to see the mathematical and the computerized nature of all of this, that my system was organized like a supercomputer. And that these 144 alters that made up this shell, when I looked inside and I went to map out how this worked, because I did drawings and diagrams, I found that I saw this little arc around a little dot that was me, the host system, and then underneath that arc was this humongous abyss, that this was only the tiniest, topmost part of my system, and underneath this shell that kept the rest of my system separated from me consciously was a vast super system that went beyond anything that I could comprehend, and it freaked me out really, really bad, and I found it very frightening. But I also got excited because I realized that my system was so compartmentalized and mathematically structured that it was actually going to be easier for me to integrate and deprogram, that it was so well organized and so well thought out that I was going to have a better time in my eyes doing this work than if my system was more the chaotic jumble that I saw in my host self, because the host system was very damaged and not so robotic and very quickly kind of dissolved in structure when I got to know them. But these paradigm operators were very organized, and when they let me in and allowed me to deprogram and start seeing the rest of my system, I quickly found that my system was way too big to map, and that my system was way bigger than I could understand. And so I found that at the core of myself, I had 4 parts. Sorry, I flashed my fingers there for a second. I had 4 parts that made up my core self. And one of those parts was involved in my host self that I could identify at the time. All parts of me I found out that I know of are in one of the 4 core parts of myself, meaning that my core self split into quadrants, and then out of each quadrant was spawned these massive super systems, and that the essence nature of every part of me in my system can be linked to one of these 4 core parts. And I've since done an integration around this where now I see that all of those parts are me, but I still have multiplicity, and I still find it very useful to track which part of me is linked to which essence quadrant of me. So that's the most that I've been able to do on a grand scale, is understand which part of me is linked to which essential core part. But every time I encounter a new system, I find it helpful to at least ask how big the system is, or at least how big the greeter parts know that the system is, the parts that welcome me into the system, and then I can get a better feel for what I'm working with. But it was difficult letting go of the need to know everyone who is inside all the time. But I have found it useful to try some strategies for getting to know parts and names and dates and drawings and diagrams and all that. Okay, I hope that's helpful, and that's all I got for this video. Thank you.